Hey, yo, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over the best decks in the standard format heading into the upcoming Pokemon TCG World Championships. The Pokemon TCG World Championships is just in a couple of weeks, and it is the biggest Pokemon trading card game tournament of the year. So today I'm going to be going over my personal thoughts on the format and exactly what I think the best decks are. With that being said, if you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. And if you're looking for more videos like this, make sure to hit that notification bell so you know when my videos go live. All right, let's hop right into it. Alrighty, hopping in number 10 here, we have Chien-Pao EX. Chien-Pao EX is still a relatively solid deck, and I definitely expected to see play at the World Championships. There are a couple of brand new cards from Shrouded Fable that you could potentially add in, specifically Nightly Stretcher and also Pheasantipity EX. However, I think the third Super Rod is a little bit better than Stretcher overall, and I think Pheasantipity EX is a solid card. However, you run into problems with bench space already to begin with this deck, so potentially adding in something like the Pheasantipity might kind of amplify that, as you just don't necessarily have a whole lot of bench space to start off with. But you know, those could be two cards that you consider putting in your list. At the moment, I don't have them in, but I could definitely understand the logic behind it. Overall, you know, Chien-Pao is a deck that, you know, when it gets set up, there are a lot of moving parts. You need to get things down like the Baxcalibur, also the B-Barrel as well. When you get everything down, the deck feels great. However, this deck does oftentimes struggle with consistency, just not being able to set itself up as much as it would like. However, when it gets going, it's really powerful. It does take a relatively close matchup against one of the more hyped up decks in the format, Regidrago. Its Charizard matchup is a little bit sketchier now because they do play things like the Dusknoir line and also Unfair Stamp as well. Those are kind of two cards that you kind of have to worry about. So yeah, like overall, I think it takes a lot of close matchups and it does have some consistency problems, but when it does get set up, it definitely is really powerful and can beat most things in the format. It's still a pretty good deck, and I would not be surprised to see it see success. I do, however, think there are some decks that are slightly better than it though. Alrighty, hopping into number 9 here, we have Miraidon. Miraidon does gain a brand new card, which is Pheasantipity. Pretty much all these kind of turbo-based decks do gain the ability to play Pheasantipity, and it works really well in this deck. Miraidon, in my opinion, is a deck that oftentimes can find those first 4 prize cards, you know, pretty easily. However, it just doesn't necessarily have the draw power to be able to find those last resources to finish off games. However, with the Pheasantipity, you are able to get there more consistently. Overall, I think the deck is pretty fair. You know, like if you do hit turn 1 hands, yes, you are going to beat a lot of decks on the spot. However, there are plenty of high basic HP decks where, you know, being able to hit turn 1 Iron Hands doesn't necessarily do a whole lot. So the deck just kind of feels fair. It, you know, feels relatively average. It takes a really iffy matchup against things like Regidrago. Also doesn't necessarily do as well as you would like against things like the Gardevoir matchup. If Gardevoir is able to go second, get the turn 1 Technical Machine Evo off to get Curly, as the matchup actually doesn't feel necessarily very good, which in the past Miraidon was always a deck that you really wanted to kind of go like all in on beating, you know, a specific group of the top decks, whereas now it's not necessarily really able to do that, I think. So, you know, I do think it has some problems. I think inherently it's a solid deck, but I think it's just pretty average as of right now. I could definitely see it, you know, seeing some success, but as of right now, that's why I have it number 9. It's decent, not overpowering, it's okay. Gaining Pheasantipity is nice, but it feels relatively balanced. Alrighty, hopping into number 8 here, we have Raging Bolt. Raging Bolt does gain a brand new card from Shrouded Fable, which is Pheasantipity, which is really nice for that consistency, especially late game, allowing you to draw 3 cards when one of your Pokemon was knocked out. The deck remains relatively the same. Go as fast as you can. You got things like 4 trekking shoes, multiple Pokestops as well. You have access to Teal Mask Ogerpon's ability, which allows you to draw cards and also get energy onto the board. You got Radiant Greninja as well, just trying to burn through your deck as quickly as possible. I personally am a fan of the Pokemon catchers. I think Pokemon catchers are really good in a deck like this, just because hitting turn 1 Pokemon catcher knockout with a Raging Bolt is just so powerful. You can just instantly win games on the spot with that. Kind of reminiscent of Fusion Mew, where if Fusion Mew was able just to get the turn 1 Melodious Echo knock out the only threat on the field on the first turn, your opponent would just pretty much instantly lose the game. This deck kind of has that factor where if you hit to the turn one Sadas Pokemon Catcher KO on the only Pokemon that is a threat, you can just instantly win games. And I think heading into the World Championships, I think that does have definitely a lot of value. I think that playing a deck that kind of has the ability just to run anyone over no matter how good they are, definitely I think is a worthwhile consideration heading into the tournament. However, I do think it's matchup spread if your opponent is kind of able to set up through that first or second turn of the game where your deck is so strong is relatively average. It takes a lot of 50-50s, 45-55s. It does take a decent Regidrago matchup, which is really, really important. However, its matchups against things like Gardevoir are very, very scary. Its matchup against Charizard as well isn't great. So it does have some glaring weaknesses, but it does have some things going for it. All right, let's hop into number 7. Coming in here at number 7, we have Dragapult. Dragapult's still a very, very solid deck. Being able to use that Phantom Dive as quickly as possible is your goal. Paired up with also things like a Dusclops and a Dusknoir can create some crazy situations where you can take some huge multi-prize turns. You have things like Alakazam as well, very good against the Gardevoir matchup. You get a little bit more control over where their damage goes. I think the deck is decent. Is it better than Charizard? I'm not necessarily 100% sure. I don't think it's stronger than Charizard. However, it has, I think, more polarizing matchups where it's really good against some decks and then some decks it's not really good against, where I feel like Charizard is just kind of a relatively balanced deck overall. You kind of have a shot versus most things. I think Dragapult is a little bit more inconsistent as well at times, just because you need a little bit more to get going. You have to find either 2 energies or something like the Neo Upper as well, whereas Charizard, you're just able to use that Infernal Rain to be able to get energies on board. So this deck does have a few problems, but it is pretty decent against things like the Gardevoir matchups, pretty solid against that because you have access to Phantom Dive and also things like Dusclops and Dusknoir, creating multi-prize scenarios. I think a big problem with this deck is, I think, the Regidrago matchup. They pretty much just do what you want to do, except more consistently, and I think that's a big issue that you have. However, I do think this deck is going to show up. I don't think it's necessarily capable of winning the World Championships. I think it has potential to see success, but I think there are just some decks that are a little bit stronger than it. Overall, it's just kind of a balanced deck. It's fair. There's some, pretty cool things you can now do with things like the Dusknoir, but I don't necessarily think it's overwhelming in any way. It's just a solid overall deck. I would say it's about a tier 2. Alrighty, hopping into number 6 here, we have Snorlax. Snorlax is a deck that when everyone is talking about it, right after it finished really well at a tournament, it gets over-teched for and the deck really struggles to see success. However, when the deck stops getting talked about, people start to cut the text, the deck becomes a really, really powerful deck in the format. And at the moment, looking back at the most recent tournament, the North American International Championships, there was one in top 16. However, the deck didn't necessarily dominate the event, and I don't think that many people heading into Worlds are going to be teching for this deck, which in my opinion makes it a relatively solid play for the World Championships. Stall has been a deck that has seen quite a bit of success this previous season, winning 2 regional championships both in Europe, and I think heading into Worlds actually gets a lot better with the brand new Xerosic card. This card is really, really powerful, forcing your opponent to discard their hand all the way down to 3. One of the most important ways that players can beat Stall is focusing on resource conservation, which means that often requires them to build up huge hands. However, Xerosic is able to punish that, forcing them back down to 3 and making them discard really important resources. This card also means you don't necessarily have to play the 2 fire energies and also the Chi-Yu as well. As long as you don't really care about the mirror match, you can cut those cards because you should be able to deck people out with something like the Xerosic instead, which opens up more space in this deck for things like the Ogerpon, which is really good against the Charizard matchup. And you got things also like the double Artisan for consistency. You have handheld fan as well for the Gardevoir matchup. You pretty much can fit whatever you really need in this deck when you don't play something like the Chi-Yu. Overall, I think the deck is good. It takes a really, really sketchy matchup against the Gardevoir matchup. If they do play 2 Turo, if they play 1, it's relatively okay. If they play 2, it can be really, really scary. And also the Regidrago matchup really kind of depends on how many, switch cards, whether or not they play things like Turo, whether or not they play the Cologne, which most should be playing because of Kyurem. It kind of just depends on exactly what outs they have to block. And if they have a lot of them, it can be pretty tough stuff. However, if you are able to use something like the Eerie or Fortune Sisters to get rid of them, you definitely could put yourself in a position to win. But overall, I think the deck is good, one of the stronger decks in the format. However, there is always a risk playing this deck as well, with the risk factor of tying, especially at, you know, Worlds, with ties not being necessarily very good with the structure. Also moving into the 2024-2025 season with the new structure and how many rounds you're going to be playing, maybe Snorlax is a little bit more of a risky play. But overall, the power is there, the matchups are there. It's just you do take some really rough matchups against things like Lugia and any deck that might be overteching for stall. But overall, it's a good deck, and I definitely think we'll show up and see some success. Alrighty, hopping into number 5 here, we have Lugia VSTAR. Lugia VSTAR has been around for quite some time, and I think it's actually a little bit better than people give it credit for as of right now. Lugia VSTAR, in my opinion, is best paired up with Chien-Pao. I know we've seen the non-Chien-Pao variants, but with decks like Charizard getting a lot of hype moving forward, I think having access to Chien-Pao is very good, and also it is really helpful against the Regidrago matchup as well. I have decided to add in a one of tech of V-Guard Energy. The V-Guard Energy is very good against Regidrago because a lot of Regidrago lists are cutting Raging Bolt in favor of the Giratina VSTAR, which means that their damage cap maxes out at 280, meaning if you use this V-Guard on something like Lugia VSTAR or possibly the Blood Moon Ursaluna, something like Giratina VSTAR is not actually able to knock you out, making that matchup actually relatively decent. The number one thing holding Lugia back, though, is itself. This deck just sometimes does not set up and function as it's supposed to. However, if the deck is able to set up and get going, I do think this deck is a dark horse candidate to see a lot of success heading into Worlds. Kind of like Fusion Mew. Fusion Mew heading into the last World Championships in Yokohama in August of 2023 wasn't necessarily getting a whole lot of hype. However, it really just had the perfect metaphor, and it saw a ton of success, obviously winning the World Championships and multiple in top cut. This deck kind of reminds me of that, where it's a deck that we've known has been good for quite some time, however has a lot of problems, but if you can figure out how to fix those problems, it truly is an incredibly powerful deck still. Lugia is a good deck. I definitely think it's going to see some success. However, it just doesn't function sometimes, and I think that's the biggest thing holding it back. Alrighty, hopping into number 4 here, we have Lost Zone Toolbox. Just standard Lost Zone, very similar to the list that Andrew Hedrick used to win the most recent North American International Championships. I have included that Manaphy though, as it is quite powerful against the mirror match and also versus decks that might be running that one of Kyurem. Making sure that you can have that down just to be safe is very, very nice. The deck is still good, you know, being able to utilize Colress and Flower Selecting to get tons of cards into the Lost Zone. Things like Pokestop and Lost Vacuum really allow you to burn through your deck very quickly to pull off turn 2 Sableye, turn 1 Radiant Greninja is possible, turn 1 or turn 2 Iron Hands. There's just so many things that you can do with this deck. Radiant Ursaluna as well really unlock this deck, in my opinion. Just such a powerful attacker. Pretty much every Lost Zone deck has access to a Radiant Zard now. You know, being able to use this card effectively with 1 or sometimes, you know, 0 to hit for 240 is just, you know, so powerful. Very, very good deck, in my opinion. Not much else to say. It's consistent. I am a little bit concerned about Kyurem, and I also think matchups against Regidrago and Gardevoir and also Charizard, if the deck techs things like the Jirachi, are pretty scary. However, you definitely have lines against them. The deck is very consistent. That's probably the biggest thing, you know, going for the deck. You're pretty much able to set up every single game. However, some of its matchups do get a little bit more sketchy heading into this event, and also the fact that Kyurem is going to be roaming around. You have to add in something like Manaphy, which doesn't necessarily feel great, but I still think the deck is very, very powerful, and I expect it to do well at the World Championships. Alrighty, hopping in number 3 here, we have one of the more hyped up decks heading into the World Championships, and that is going to be Regidrago VSTAR. Regidrago VSTAR has been getting quite a bit of hype after its relatively impressive performance at the North American International Championships. We saw Jacob I get top 16. There were multiple others in day 2 as well, and the deck was finally put on the map, and I think it's really, really good right now. It does gain the brand new card Kyurem, which allows you to deal 110 damage to 3 3 of your opponent's Pokemon. This card is really good against decks like Lost Zone Toolbox and pretty much any other setup based deck in the format like Charizard, Gardevoir, or Dragapult. However, its attack is relatively difficult to pull off, requiring 5 energy to actually pull off its attack. However, its ability does read that if your opponent has a Colress in the discard pile, this attack only costs 1, which is significantly easier to pull off. However, still it can be relatively difficult to use against all of the other decks that don't play Colress, which is the majority of decks in the format. However, using Apex Dragon means you can copy the Kyurem when it's in the discard pile for only 3 energies. So that is a big thing that I think makes this deck significantly stronger heading into Worlds, is you have the ability to board wipe by using that Regidrago VSTAR's Apex Dragon to copy the Kyurem. You also have cards like Canceling Cologne as well. We're going to see a lot more decks that are going to be adding in Manaphy to protect against this Kyurem. Specifically, decks like Lost Zone Toolbox should be playing Manaphy moving forward. Decks like Charizard and Dragapult, when you play against them, they should be typically putting down Manaphy, which means that if you play Canceling Cologne, if you bring up the Manaphy and use the Canceling Cologne, you can then use Kyurem's attack with the Apex Dragon to board wipe them. So overall, I think this deck is really powerful. The ability of hitting turn 2 Dragapult pretty consistently is just really strong. I personally think that this deck is stronger than regular Dragapult just because it's more consistent and it has more options. You have things like the Hisuian Gudra VSTAR, which is really powerful against the Lugia VSTAR matchup, also decent in the mirror match and versus Raging Bolt as well. You have Giratina VSTAR as well, which is a great one-shot potential card that can pretty much take out those higher HP Pokemon, and anything that you can't one-shot with that 280, you can soften up first with something like that Phantom Dive, spread damage to then open that up. We got Squawkabilly as well. Squawkabilly for that turn 1 consistency, just being able to get cards in the discard pile. It's really important because to use Apex Dragon, you need to get those Dragon Pokemon into the discard pile, and Squawkabilly helps out at doing that. Also have Radiant Charizard as well. Radiant Charizard is a really nice card towards the end of the game. Great one prize attacker. Sometimes you really run low on resources because using Regidrago's Apex Dragon does take 3 energies. You do have the energy switches, but your deck burns a lot of resources, which means that sometimes it's difficult to make a final Regidrago, but with something like Radiant Charizard, you are able to clean up games relatively nicely with it. So overall, I think this deck is really powerful, one of my favorite decks currently in the standard format, and I think it has a lot of potential to do well. It can sometimes struggle a little bit with consistency. Sometimes you burn through a lot of cards and you just aren't able to necessarily set up, very well. However, the majority of the time I found myself able to function. I think it's really good. When you get going, it's really powerful. You have a lot of cool options, and I think it's one of the strongest decks in the format. However, I think there's 2 other decks that I think might just be a little bit better for this tournament. All right, let's hop into them. Alrighty, hopping into number 2 here, we have Gardevoir EX. Gardevoir EX, still one of the most powerful decks in the format, and I think will have a big showing at the World Championships. There have been some lists that have been going around that have been cutting the Bravery Charms in favor of an extra Flutter Mane and potentially adding in another Technical Machine de-evolution, but I do think that the Bravery Charm variant, in my opinion, is a little bit better as of right now, just with kind of where the metagame is going, especially with decks like Regidrago seeing more play Bolt, and also Lugia putting themselves in decent positions as well. I think having Bravery Charm to be able to one-shot with the balloon is very nice. So I personally am pro Bravery Charm. I also do have the Technical Machine de-evolution as well. Very good in the Charizard matchup. Makes that matchup much more winnable for sure. Also very good versus the Dragapult matchup as well. The deck is still great. It can still, pretty much win every single matchup. You have an opportunity in most games. It can be a difficult deck to play, but you do have that skill expression though. You have the ability to outplay your opponents, and yeah, it's a great deck. Not much else to say. However, I think there's one deck that has seen a little bit more talk right now, and I think is the top dog heading into the World Championships. Alrighty, hopping into number 1 here, we have Charizard EX. Charizard EX has been getting so much hype with the brand new Dusknoir line that is being included in this deck. Dusclops allows you to put 5 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. In return, you knock it out, and Dusknoir puts 13 damage counters on any of your opponent's Pokemon. So this will give yourself the opportunity to take big multi-prize knockouts. Also, giving them a prize card is typically not the biggest of deals anyways. It makes your Charizard deal more damage as well. Opens up things like Iono into lower counts just puts a lot more pressure on, opens up things like Defiance Band as well. It really just opens up this deck. Just the threat of being able to get out a Dusknoir or Dusclops is really what makes this deck so powerful moving forward. Now, some people have been wanting to add in things like Fezandipity. I have personally chosen to go with the B-Barrel instead. I think the B-Barrel engine is a little bit stronger than Fezandipity. Having Rotom and also Fezandipity on the field, which a lot of the time you're going to have, oftentimes can create situations where your opponent doesn't actually necessarily need to focus on knocking out something like the Charizard and can just focus on those easy 2-prize knockouts. So at the moment, currently, I like the B-Barrel a little bit more. I have decided to cut the Cleffa as well, with Dragapult being such a powerful card right now in the standard format. We got regular Dragapult seeing plenty of play, and then also Regidrago being able to utilize Dragapult's Phantom Dive. Also with things like Dusclops and Dusknoir seeing play now, that 30 HP Pokemon is kind of a liability in a lot of situations. So I have decided to cut that card as well, which opens up more space for the Dusknoir line. But yeah, Zard still one of the most powerful decks, and in my opinion is the top dog heading into the World Championships. But with that being said, let me know what you think of the list. The deck lists will be in the comments as well. And with that being said, if you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. This is Smart TCG. Best of luck for anyone attending the World Championships or wants to stay tuned with it. These, in my opinion, are the strongest decks heading into that event. But anyways, thank you so much. I'll speak with you again soon. Peace out.